American history, whether it's educational history, governmental history, or anything, it doesn't just come out of nowhere. The history that comes out of nowhere is creation. Okay, so we're way past that when America is discovered, when it begins to be, well, if we want to be real accurate, it's already somewhat populated, when it begins to become civilized. And I know people don't like that term, but the Indian civilizations weren't very civil. They fought one another, they wore very little clothing, they had advancements in spear technology. But anyway, so while we're going to just kind of say that was first quarter or whatever, first quarter, now we're in American history, we can't forget the things that we've been talking about, because they're going to, even today, things that we've learned the last class period or talked about the last class period are going to influence what we talk about today. So I have divided this into, let's see, 1, 2, 3, 4, about 4 categories, 4 or 5 categories. I know that's real definite. 4 or 5 categories. And the first category I'm calling colonial education. So we're going to talk about colonial education and maybe get into a little bit of little past the establishment of the states. But colonial education, and to just put an not really arbitrary, but to put a hard date on the time period, we're going to say it's from 1607 to 1776. Obviously, when we're talking about history, you know, it's not like all the educational things we're talking about all of a sudden just shifted in 1776. There was a tremendous shift in 1776, our Declaration of Independence from England, but what happened day to day would be gradually developing. So, but as we think of this time period of colonial America, we generally, I think even beyond educational aspects, throughout America, we divide what is happening into 3 sections. If you think back to American history, most of you can do that. In the colonial time period, how would we divide America geographically? When I say sections, I'm talking about geographical sections. Can you think of any distinctions between the sections geographically? I think I've given a significant hint when I said it's 3. So, Josh, do you have any ideas?
New England?
Very good. New England is 1. Okay? What might be another one? I'm going to call on people who have not answered. Robert. New England's 1. Where's New England? North. So what might be another one? South. Very good. Very good. Yes. So New England, the South, and really hard. What do you think might be in the middle? You guys are so smart. Yes. South, middle, and New England. All right. And really, it's not, those are accurate descriptions. And there's differences there. You think, okay, in the South, what type of, how did they live in the South? I know in 1607 there wasn't much there, but we're talking 150 years or more. 1607 to 1776. As people moved into the South, how did they live in the South? Rebecca?
It was more rural farming.
Rural farming. They did farm up north, but what kind of farming did they do in the South? I'll be careful. Be accurate. What do you think?
They did a lot of cotton farming.
Wrong. That was later. What did they do first? Josh got all excited about that one. What was it?
Tobacco.
Tobacco. That's right. He's all excited about the tobacco. No, it was tobacco farming. And both tobacco and cotton has characteristics that it takes a lot of land, and cotton even more labor. Okay, so there's these large farms that come to be known as what? Plantations. So it is agricultural and large farms. So if you have a large farm, what does that, that just automatically implies that your neighbor lives far away. not next door is not so close. So there's the agricultural aspect there. There is, because there's fewer people and big farms, big plantations, it's more of an aristocratic type of society. A lot of people fairly well off as long as the crops work out. It's lower density of people because the type of crops are labor intensive. There is slavery there. There's more slavery later on, like we say, but there's slavery. And in your thinking, can you think about, or do you know, what type of religious background do most of the people in the southern, and south means Virginia, the Carolinas, basically that's the South, Georgia. What type of religious background do those people have? Serenity. They're Anglican. They're Anglican. What is Anglican? What is Anglican in America? How many don't have any idea? Okay. You do see some Anglican churches around, but the Anglicans in America, with very little difference between them, are Episcopalians. Okay, so Episcopalians are Anglican in practice. Probably the Episcopalians don't, they're probably separate from the monarchy. I don't know my church government that well. But the Anglican government is not, or the Anglican churches are not separate from the monarchy. The king is the head of the church, or the queen, and pretty much leaves all of her religious duties to the Archbishop of Canterbury. But, so they're Anglican. They have, in that sense, they, even religiously, they have strong ties to England. They didn't come to the New World. Well, why did they go to Jamestown? Jamestown is Virginia. Was it because of religious persecution that they went to Jamestown? No. Okay. So now Jamestown didn't succeed, but they continue to go. I'm not saying people didn't go there because they wanted to worship God the way that they felt they should, but generally Virginia, though they're more, I would say they're more secular in mind. I'm not trying to say that our founding fathers were secular. They were very religious. But the purpose for coming there was exploration, commerce, and those types of things. So they have closer ties to England. And I don't know the root or where the word comes from, but you have a lot more what we would end up calling Tories there. A Tory was somebody whose loyalty remained to the king throughout the conflict. So in that environment, education is more of a private matter. This will be more easily understood once we get into New England. Okay, but it's a private matter. That doesn't mean that, they all homeschooled the way we understand homeschooling. But it does mean most education happened on their farm, which was a plantation. Okay, now they had a lot of people that lived on the plantation. Sometimes they would travel beyond their own home, but there was not a lot of people in one place that could pool the resources as much, because they were a farther distance, and so it's more of a private matter. If you've read much, you read of like even George Washington, and he as a child is 130 years after the first founding in Virginia. His parents send him off to school. They bring a teacher in, and so he goes to a school, but it's not a large thing. There's not a lot of other families in those situations. It's worth mentioning that there were 2 early attempts to set up free schools. Now we're going to follow this idea some because admittedly free's not free, nothing's free, but that's what we have today in America is free schools. The public government schools are quote-unquote free. So the first one of those was in 1635. So that's pretty early. So even though these people didn't come for religious freedom, they're concerned about the education of their children, and even for the education of people that couldn't hire a teacher or something like that. The man's name that is closely related with this is Benjamin Sims, S-I-M-M-E-S, Benjamin Sims. And now I can't remember whether he was the teacher or the benefactor, or whatever. But somehow, somebody, probably he, donated 200 acres of land and 8 cows for the sustenance of a school that would be free, that people could go to without having to pay. So the 200 acres, whatever the tobacco from that, and the 8 cows would be, the proceeds from that would be used to pay a teacher, and, maybe they got together and built something, whatever, and said anybody that wants to can come. It was unsuccessful in 1635, primarily because people were independent enough and were not ready to accept handouts. Maybe self-sufficient enough. But there must have been some people that were not rich enough to have their own teachers, because somebody thought, well, let's do this for these people, and generally the people that it was provided for were like, well, we're not that poor. We can handle this, make do some way or another. Another one, and of course, I don't know, I also don't know exactly where these are. They're in the South, but think of Virginia at that time included West Virginia, Kentucky. It was a large area, huge. colony. And then the Carolinas, North and South Carolina. So this is a lot of area. Obviously, everybody in the area didn't even know about these. But the next one was successful, or it still exists, let's put it that way. And this was in 1659. 1659, Thomas Eaton, E-A-T-O-N. Thomas Eaton, well, let's just say he gave 500 acres, a whole herd of cows, and some slaves to sustain the teacher and the existence of a school. I don't know what they called it then, but this school became Hampton Academy. Okay, so I heard some hmms. What's about Hampton Academy? Does anybody know anything significant about Hampton Academy? I heard some hmms. You think there is something significant about it? What do you think, Sarah?
Well, George Washington Carver went to Hampton Institute. Is that different?
Wrong guy, but kind of closely. George Washington Carver I don't think he went there.
Oh.
He's more known for his association with Tuskegee.
Because he made it.
Tuskegee Institute.
He started that one.
Well, you're confusing your great black leaders of the South. No, he was a good man. He really was. He's one that we really should look up to and learn from. So once I point out her error, other people are thinking of who? Booker T. Washington.
Oh.
Yes. Booker T. Washington, if you know the story, he went there, wanted to get in, didn't know that he would even be able to get in, was told to clean the room or whatever. That happened at Hampton, at the Hampton Academy. And then he continued to learn there, and then went on to teach there, and then went on to found the Tuskegee. I don't know how Tuskegee. Anybody from Alabama? How do you say that? Tuskegee? Tuskegee? Yeah, I always called it Tuskegee until recently people have told me I've been saying it wrong. But I've said it like that for so long, I'm stuck in my ways. Anyway, Hampton Academy. Hampton Academy is started as free, offered to people, and sustained by 500 acres of land, a herd of cows, and some slaves to help work the land, I'm sure. Okay, so that's all we're going to say about the education in the South for this time period. Now let's just take a couple minutes and talk about the education in the middle colonies. Let's just first think about what would be the middle colonies. Should I be mean? Shem, what do you think? I'm teasing you. Alan? Middle colonies, the rest of us. Just one of them. Maryland, okay? Maryland, why is it called Maryland? Why is it called Maryland?
They were Catholic, so it's
They were Catholic, okay? So Maryland are Catholics. Catholics moved to Maryland because of discomfort, at least, maybe even persecution. I don't know my history that well, but they moved there, okay? So they're Catholic there. They have, well, depending on who the king is, they have some loyalty to the king, probably King Charles II, but after that, not so much. So they're Catholic there. What would be another middle colony? Ohio, a little bit later. That's Northwest Ordinance. Pennsylvania. What's in Pennsylvania? Who founds Pennsylvania? William Penn. Yes. Okay. But William Penn. And what's the thinking behind the founding of Pennsylvania? Are you from Pennsylvania? Okay, all right, so tell us. You know better than I do. They were Quakers. And what kind of people came to Pennsylvania? There's a reason they call it Pennsylvania Dutch. What kind of people came to Pennsylvania? Huh? They were German, yes. It's Deutsch. It's not, we say Dutch, but it's Deutschland. Okay, so a lot of Germans in Pennsylvania. Okay, so you have in Maryland, a lot of English Catholics. In Pennsylvania, a lot of Quakers, a lot of Germans. What about New York? What was New York called at this time? So I thought this was going to be fundamentals of education. New Amsterdam. Ah, yes. Yes. So now what kind of people probably came to New Amsterdam? That would be the Dutch people. Right? It's Dutch, Holland, Amsterdam? Yes. Okay. And they're going to be, if they're coming for religious reasons, they're going to have some Lutheran there. They're not far from Germany. Some not Lutheran, but Protestant background, what we would call Reformed. Now we would call it Reformed background, Dutch Reformed. Heard of that? Okay. All right, so we have some Dutch people there. We have some German people. We have some English people. Okay, we have some Catholic people, some Quaker people, some Congregationalist or Reformed type people. Lots of variety. Lots of variety. That's the picture that we should, at this time period, there's a lot of variety there. There are larger centers or larger groups of people in the middle colonies, not so much as New England, but there are larger groups of people, but there is they are still groups. They're identifiable groups. There's a lot of diversity. We do have religious freedom there. The Catholics have religious freedom, and they provide religious freedom in Maryland, believe it or not, out of the persecution that they had, they're allowed for religious freedom. The Quakers, for sure, religious freedom. So there's generally religious freedom in the middle colonies. And for that matter, in the South, there wasn't so much religious freedom. There were Anglicans, and if you were not part of the Anglican Church, you were at least frowned upon, and probably much more. So there's religious freedom. They're beginning to have representative government. And in the South, there is some representative government. It develops, just to contrast some, but they start out as being charters, they have royal charters. Their authority comes from the king. So the king has the king appoints the governor type of thing, which is different than, I think I got the wrong name there, but different from these that we're talking about. These have more representative government and a tremendous amount of diversity. And so they are concerned about education, and they do educate their children, but there's not so many developments as far as people working together in education because of the diversity. You know, the German kids and the Dutch kids can't go to the same school. At this point, these colonies are just colonies. They're not united by anything except for their geography. They don't really have any loyalty to one another or anything like that. They have religious differences. And obviously, since they're from different backgrounds, they have cultural differences. And since education is primarily the transmission of a culture from one generation to another, right? You're not going to have, well, we're German. We're going to transmit that to our children. We're Dutch. We're Catholic, whatever. And so while there is education taking place, there's not a lot of cooperation in education taking place. Just cooperation within those groups, which is not a bad thing. It's just reporting on what happened there. I will note, or we should note, that there's a man named Christopher Dock. Christopher Dock, D-O-C-K. He's the first person to write a book on educational practices, to write anything about education in the United States. Well, which was not the United States, in the colonies. And his book, I'm going to give you the translation of the name of it. I'm pretty sure it was written in German. Okay. It was called School Management. It's just kind of maybe a trivia thing. People were writing about education, but he's the first on this side of the Atlantic to write and publish a book on education practices called School Management, Christopher Dock. All right, so the rest of our time we're going to talk about New England. New England in America has maybe not so much anymore, but for a long time it had tremendous influence on what happened in American education. Its influence is greatest later when America is America, the United States of America, but I think its influence grows out of what happens right here. So New England, we remember, comes from the Pilgrims and the Puritans. They come in 1620, and then they come back, and there's more. There's Massachusetts Bay Colony. And we should remember, because it's very significant to what we're talking about and what happens, what a Puritan and what a Pilgrim was. Okay? Generally, who were the Pilgrims? So now we should be getting closer to what things that you know, not just American history, but I think we have some church history blending in here. Who were the Puritans? Mary?
Separatists?
Separatists, mostly separatists. But what was a separatist? What were they separating from? The Church of England. Okay? So they were separatists. They were separating from the Church of England. And so they had particular beliefs and particular ways they felt they should practice their religious beliefs. They'd also be called nonconformists. And the short of their history is they left England, went to Holland, and then came to America. So they came to America so that they could worship God in the way that they felt was right. In a certain sense, in the general sense that we think of it, they did not come to America for religious liberty. Notice the difference of why I said they came to America and the difference. They came so that they could worship God in the way that they felt was right, which we have an affinity for, because what they thought was right is a lot closer to what we think is right. But as a matter of fact, they persecuted us if we were alive at that time. They persecuted Baptists themselves. So they didn't come for religious liberty. They came so that they could worship God in the way that they thought was right. Puritans, on the other hand, also came for that same reason, and would say that once the Puritans come to America, they have a lot more in common with the separatists. But the Puritan thought was that there's something wrong with the church and we should fix it. But purify the church. But some of them must not have been making quick enough strides, and so they came to America. But that's probably where you're going to have your Episcopals in New England. Or at that time, there's still Anglicans. In the Anglican church, you have high high church Anglicans and low church Anglicans. And the difference between them is where their authority for church government comes from. The high church Anglicans' authority comes from on high, from the king. The low church Anglicans, their authority comes from the congregation. And so when you read history, it's interesting to note that a man like George Washington came from a low church Anglican background. And that's why he would not feel so much loyalty to the king. He wasn't, I don't know what he went to growing up, but he came to believe that the church itself, the people in the church, should be able to govern themselves. Anyway, and I should point out, I think this is not church history class, but I'll point it out. Methodists are Anglicans, right? John Wesley was an Anglican who added some methods and some, more stringent, principles to follow in his life than the general church. So, anyway, that's out of this class. So, the Puritan and separatist Pilgrim thought was the most significant force in shaping American attitudes and values. We have tremendous number of people coming into Massachusetts. Virginia and Massachusetts are the leaders of the American colonies. Would you agree with that, pretty much? I think we can see that looking back there. And really, Massachusetts is way ahead of Virginia. As we get closer to the War for Independence, they're probably equal. A lot of great Virginians. But early on, Massachusetts, which is dominated by separatists and Puritans, is the driving force in the colonies. If there is any influence, they're the ones exerting their influence on the other colonies in their attitudes, their values. Now, where did they get their values from? Where did the Puritans and Pilgrims get their values from? Historically, thinking historically, not like what person or whatever. Where did they get their values from? I have 1, 2, 3 people kind of. Rick, what do you think?
Well, I think they got it from the Bible.
From the Bible. Okay, why did they get it from the Bible?
It's just a guess.
Okay, it's true, but and it was just a guess. So it's a good guess, but we don't know why it's true yet. Okay, historically, we have some historical mind people that are thinking historically here. I can tell. Let's go with Serenity this time.
They had schools.
They had schools.
They wanted to teach their children to read the Bible.
Okay, they did have schools, and that's a result of this. But why? But so that's later in where we're going. Where did they get their values from? From the Bible. Okay, think historically. We're talking what time? 1620, 1630. Okay. So where did they get their values from? From the Bible. Why did they go to the Bible to get their values? What do you think, Mary?
The Bible had just been printed with the 1611 KJV version. It's just been allowed for the people to read.
Okay, that's somewhat true. They probably didn't use the 1611 King James Version. It's quite certain that they didn't use it, because it wouldn't have been that popular by 1620. It grew in popularity. They probably used the Geneva Bible, which was in English. Okay, so, and where would the idea that you would read the Bible in your own language come from? Okay, now the class, everybody in the class should have their hands up now. Where would the idea that you would read the Bible in your own language come from? We're going to celebrate it here in about 20 days. October 31st, 1517. Alan, waving at me with you.
Yeah, you mentioned the Reformation.
The Reformation. The Reformation. So the Reformation, remember, in a certain sense, breaks people free from the Catholic Church. What kind of schools gained popularity in the Reformation? It starts with a V. Let's just put it in the vernacular. Okay? Right? Put it in the vernacular, which is the common man's language. And for these separatists and Puritans, that was English. Okay? So, a little longer there than what I thought. But, so where did these people get their values from? They got them from the Bible. They got them from the Bible because they had come out of the Reformation. They're reformers. They're Protestants. There are some Baptists there, but of course they're going to persecute the Baptists. But, and what are the Reformation ideals? The Scriptures. Okay? And there's 5 solas, but primarily the Scriptures are the basis for belief and practice. And really, and since the Scriptures are so important, everybody should be able to read them. Right? So we should get them into in the common person's language, and then we should teach everybody to be able to read. Okay? So the principle of what we might say, the principle of universal literacy. Wow, that was loud. The principle of universal literacy. We didn't say it this way last class period. But universal literacy, what does that mean? Everybody should be able to read. Why should everybody be able to read? Because everybody should be able to read the Bible. Why should everybody be able to read the Bible? Because everybody's responsible for what's in the Bible. We don't need a priest to tell us what the Bible says. We can read the Bible for ourselves. Okay, so this Reformation principle, and let's just, obviously, Baptists or people with Baptist thinking had the Bible in their own language or learned the language that the Bible is in so that they could read it and understand it. But generally, the populace, okay, this is a Reformation principle that everyone should be able to read. Well, the Puritans are part of the Reformation. The Pilgrims are part of the Reformation. They're part of and this ingrained thought in their mind comes to New England. So in New England, what are they going to do? Trinity. Make schools, right. They're going to have schools. Why? Because everybody should be able to read. All of our children should be able to read. This principle of universal literacy drives their thought. Maybe not about every single thing, but educationally it drives their thought. And so, the colonies, the Plymouth colony and the Massachusetts Bay colony, they had ordinances that directed that children should be educated. In 1642, okay, so I don't know if they were combined together by this point or which one exactly this is in, but we have the Plymouth colony, Massachusetts Bay colony. They're 2 different colonies, but basically Massachusetts area. 1642. Massachusetts Bay Colony is founded in 1630. Plymouth Colony is founded in 1620. I think my dates are right on that. And so we're talking 1642. Okay? Do you need very many laws when there's only 100 of you? You can just kind of get together and say this is what we're going to do. But you get more people and we start to need ordinances. So they have an ordinance in 1642. I'm trying to just, there's not many people around still. It's very young. That requires that all children be educated. Requires that all children be educated. So have we ever seen a law before like this, that all children should be educated? Is this new in America? It's not new. Okay? You should know that because of the way I asked the question. But what you don't remember is where you saw it before. Sarah's excited. She says, I remember. Where have we seen this before? And it's probably not the only place that it was, but in our survey of of educational history, where do we see this? Everybody, all children must be educated. Where do we see that? Sarah?
Athens.
In Athens, okay? And you remember what we said about Athens? The law required that they be educated. But it didn't say how or with what or anything, just that they should be educated. And that's exactly what we see here. The law says children must be educated. It doesn't say they have to be educated by this person in this place, just you must educate your children. And so we have the same thing happening. We have people who see the vital importance of education, and so they're decreeing everybody must educate their children, but they're not saying this is where it will take place, this is what will be taught to them. It's just they must be educated. Now then, one of the most important let's say documents in American educational history comes about 5 years later. In 1647, they passed the Old Deluder Satan Act. I will put it into common spelling. Old Deluder Satan Act. Satan is the old deluder. Okay, 1647. Okay, I'm going to read this ordinance to you. Okay, it's very easy to find it. I don't know if you have access to the internet at this moment. Maybe, maybe not. But later on, if you want the words, just Google it and copy it. Okay, don't try to just furiously type. I would rather you just listen to what I'm saying and get the thoughts. I'll try to read it as expressively as possible. So, the Act says, it being one chief project of that old deluder Satan to keep men from the knowledge of the Scriptures, as in former times, keeping them in an unknown tongue, so in these latter times, by persuading from the use of tongues, that so at least the true sense and meaning of the original might be clouded by false glosses of saint-seeming deceivers, and that learning may not be buried in the graves of our forefathers in church and commonwealth, the Lord assisting our endeavors, it is therefore ordered by this court and authority thereof. Okay, so that's the reason. That every township in this jurisdiction, after the Lord hath increased them to the number of 50 householders, shall then forthwith appoint one within their town to teach all such children as shall resort to him to write and read, whose wages shall be paid either by the parents or masters of such children, or by the inhabitants in general, by way of supply, as the major part of those that order the prudentials of the town shall appoint, provided that those which send their children be not oppressed by paying much more than they can have them taught for in other towns. It is further ordered that where any town shall increase to the number of 100 families or householders, they shall set up a grammar school, the masters thereof being able to instruct youth so far as they may be fitted for the university. And if any town neglects the performance hereof above 1 year, then every such town shall pay £5 per year, per annum, to the next such school till they shall perform this order. All right, so let's translate that. I mean, that's English, but it's a long time ago. Okay, so the reason we're putting this law in place is because Satan wants to keep men from the knowledge of the Scriptures. Okay? And the way he has done that in former times, he kept the Scriptures in an unknown tongue. In these times, he is persuading from the use of tongues, persuading people not to study languages, so that, and that in so that people will not understand the sense of the words that they're reading and will be easily deceived by people who will twist the scriptures. That's what, so the true sense and meaning of the original might be clouded by false glosses of saint-seeming deceivers, okay? People come along, say, the Bible says this, see? And you can do that, you know. He went out and hanged himself, go and do thou likewise. So we can twist scriptures to say anything we want them to say. So one reason for this law is to keep people so that they will know the scriptures. And another is that learning may not be buried in the graves of our forefathers. We know stuff. We can't lose the things that we know. Learning can't be buried with our forefathers. It needs to be passed on to succeeding generations. So that's the other reason for this law. And then they call upon the Lord to help them in their endeavors. The Lord assisting our endeavors, they order this. Okay, so what is the order? Every town that has 50 householders, so once a town grows to have 50 homes in it, they must appoint one in their town to teach any children that may or shall resort to him. Okay, so they must provide education that is available to anyone. What is that not saying? It's not, there's probably a lot of things it's not saying, but let's see, what do you think it's not saying?
It's not saying they have to be taught there.
Right. It's not telling, we have a law that tells parents they must educate their children. This law is not saying that all children must send their kids to this teacher who's provided by the town. It's not connecting those two. It's just saying you must provide education to all who want to come. So it is public education. This is public. It's open to the public. Okay? Now we're in this class going to make a distinction. We must, in order to be accurate, make a distinction between government education and public education. This is public education. It's prescribed by the government. You know, you must do this, but it's open to all, but it's not provided by the government. In fact, okay, they're to do that, and it directs how this person should be paid, right? But it directs that it can be paid two different ways. Did you notice that? It's paid either by the parents or masters of the children. So, you know, we have this guy, and if you send your children, you have to pay some money to pay for him to teach you. Or out of the inhabitants in general. So if a town has government of some sort, they have some money coming in. They have probably property taxes or something. They have some way of making money because they have. And so out of the general funds of the town that has 50 householders in it, they could pay for it that way. What is provided is that if it's the parents that have to pay, then it can't be an oppressive payment. It can't be so much that if they just sent their kids to another town, they would pay less. So then, it is further ordered that if a town grows to have 100 houses in it, they have to set up a grammar school. Now, we would think of grammar school as very low education, but you notice that this grammar school will be able to instruct them so far as they may be fitted for the university. What is the university? 1647, this law is being written. What is the university? Well, there would be, in general, there's the idea of the university. There's universities all over Europe, and while it's not as quick as flying today, there is a lot of traffic going back and forth to Europe. So they have to be ready. You know, this school that will be opened in these towns should be able to provide enough education, so it needs a teacher that will be able to teach them well enough to be ready to enter the university. There's also, by this time, already started, I think maybe 12 years in existence, Harvard College. I don't know when it became a university, but I do know that in order to get into Harvard College, at least their School of Divinity, you had to be able to translate a passage from Hebrew into Latin. So, I mean, just think about that. You speak English, and you had to translate from Hebrew into Latin, and you also had to do a Greek translation. So, you know, that's entrance exam. A little bit harder than SATs, I would say. And then if a town neglects to do that, you know, they grow to be 100 houses and they don't provide this, give them a year to be able to do that. But if they don't do that, then they have to pay £5 a year to the next town where their kids are going. So they have to help the next town because the next town is providing this service. So, this law is referred to by a lot of people across the spectrum of educators even today. Public educators are going to point out that way back, even, you know, all the way back to 1647, we had laws that provided for, or that demanded the provision of public education. And that's clearly what is here. We are saying there must be public education. What they like to forget is the reason it was provided. Because Satan is going to keep people from the knowledge of the Scriptures. I mean, a public educator who's going to go here needs to go all the way and say, well, we better be, you know, get the Scriptures back and teaching them how to accurately understand what the Scriptures say. Okay, and that's what Christian educators are going to point to that. And I would point out, and maybe it's just a big thing to me. I don't know that I hear other Christian educators pointing this out. Because our public education, what everybody calls public education today, cannot abide by this law. In America, they cannot abide by it. They kind of say that the Christian educators and philosophers would point to this as, like, we must have Christian schools and all of that. Well, in a certain sense, Christian schools of today are the public schools of the past. And other private schools, as long as they will admit anyone to come to them, are the public schools of the past. You see, there's a confusion in terms. I called it a private school, and yet unless it's just close to me and my plantation, it's really a public school. I mean, if anybody who can come to it, it's a public school, even though it's funded with private funds. See, the funding is what we're going to see probably in the next time we talk, is what changes these terms around. Public funding makes a big difference. So, these schools, yeah, okay, if we're in a Puritan community, the schools are it's going to be demanded that they teach Puritan thought. Okay, so these schools, even though they were, you know, you must teach them, you must provide them, what's going to be taught in them? Education, but Puritan thought, whether it's congregational, whatever it is there, I think it's congregational, Puritan, separatist, religious discipline. So these schools were, they did teach how to read the Bible and all that, but they were for religious discipline and to preserve doctrinal purity. There was a church-controlled government. In America, in those early states, there was a state church. That's why they could persecute people who were not part of the church. For that matter, several of our state constitutions after the ratification of our U.S. Constitution still did establish a state church. And they, for that matter, were consistent with the federal Constitution when they did that. Believe it or not. Okay? The federal Constitution said that the federal government will not establish a church or restrict the free exercise thereof. But it didn't say that states couldn't. That's why state constitutions like Connecticut and others could say, this is the church here. So, it did not necessarily permit educational freedom the way that we would think of. There was tremendous education taking place because the Reformation principle of universal literacy and all of that, but I couldn't go there and start a school and be consistent with my beliefs. There was good education taking place, and a lot of it provided to basically everyone, one way or another, but it was in line with the religious thought of the area. So you have public schools, public day schools, public in the sense that anybody can go to them. And those would be primary schools. And then you remember the phrase in it where it said grammar school? So that's going to be what would turn out what we would think in history, or you read in history of a Latin grammar school. So in primary school you'd learn to read. Latin grammar school, you would learn your Latin and learn and be prepared to enter university. Why would you need to learn Latin? Here we got it, right? This is a question that says, remember what we've been talking about, okay? Why would you need to learn Latin? You had your hand up first, we'll let you do it.
Most of the stuff that they were reading would be in Latin.
Right. Almost everything that's past primary school material is going to be in Latin, or past grammar, past secondary school. When they go to the university, they're going to be learning in Latin. Why are they going to be learning in Latin? Dave?
What was the first language in which an alphabet was developed?
That's a misunderstanding. If you got that from me, I was wrong. But it is related to that idea about the alphabet. The Latin alphabet was standardized by Alcuin, and all the great classics were translated into Latin. Okay? So if you go to the university, you're going to be learning from all the great philosophers, whether they're science philosophers, mathematic philosophers. Who's the great mathematics philosopher? Pythagoras, right? You know, we still know him, right? A squared plus b squared equals c squared. You know, of course that's not Latin, but he probably wrote it in, he wrote it in Greek, which would be what? Alpha squared plus beta squared equals, what's this, chi squared? No, that's an x. Anyway, I don't know that. I haven't read Pythagoras myself. But, so, all those philosophers, whether they're science, economics, mathematics, history, whatever, they're all the philosophers are in Latin. So you go to university, you got to know Latin. So your Latin grammar school is going to prepare you for university. You got to know Latin well, because you're just going to be sitting there reading it over and over and over again. Stacks and stacks of books in Latin. So, of course, these schools use the Bible as their textbook. And then other types of what we would call horn books and spellers came into existence. But the primary schools in particular, purpose was to teach children to be literate Christians. Primary school, they need to be literate, read the Bible, and to know why they believe the things that they did. And of course, they're going to learn some primary subjects: reading, writing, and arithmetic. The 3 R's. So this Puritan stronghold lasts until 1684. So the New England is a Puritan stronghold till 1684. And in that year, their charter was revoked. So they become, and I don't know if this is the right word historically, I didn't study it, but they become a royal charter. I think that's the idea at least. So their governor then is appointed by the king. They have less self-government. And since the king is appointing the governor, if the governor's doing what the king wishes, the king isn't so much concerned about Puritan thought and all of that type of thing. And so there's other influences brought into their culture, their communities, and their orthodoxy is weakened. Let's just mention 2 colleges. The first college in America is Harvard. I believe the date for that is 1685 or 1635. I'm pretty sure the second college in America is Yale. And now I'm just going off the top of my head. I'm pretty sure it's 1701 for the founding of Yale. And we might note that that's not long after Massachusetts loses its charter and the influences of early seeds of liberalism and that kind of stuff is starting to influence Harvard. And so they, beyond geographical reasons, there's also philosophical and theological reasons that Yale is started. Yale is also started to train people for the ministry. And we might note that the ministry training is one of the original professions, right? So. Okay, so when we come back, we will talk about the development of this system that's kind of in place. We'll mention some of the founding fathers that were influential in education, and then see what happened after we became a country. Three.